So, should melee weapons return in Borderlands 4? To quickly answer that question, yes, absolutely. But I want to dive deeper than just that and talk about why I believe they should, how I believe that they could be changed to be a better, more interactive system, and then finishing off with some concepts for melee weapons of the various manufacturers. How's it going, my Phonics fiends? It's your boy Squirts McSpunky, and let's just jump right into it. So why should melee weapons return? Simply put, more options to interact with the various systems of Borderlands is always a good thing and increases the longevity of the game. The addition of melee weapons massively opens up a lot of avenues in this way. Obviously, just being an addition to the overall loot system will provide more potential for new and cool weapons, which alone opens up new farms, playstyles, and build options. More weapons is just directly more content to interact and experiment with and expands the endgame meta. More specifically though, it's an entirely new playstyle within that loot system. Borderlands has been just guns since forever, with some of those weapons just having a blade slapped on the front of them. Melee weapons provided, in a way, entirely new gameplay. They also open up more options to interact with or create new skills surrounding them. Not only do they just make those more generic melee skills more enjoyable, but due to the various stats tied to melee weapons, it allows for more specific bonuses and therefore more interesting potential for melee-focused skills. I also just want to mention here, while I didn't really like random crits in Wonderlands for pretty much everything else, I really enjoyed it for melee. Having to aim for a head to get a crit with melee in previous games could be really obnoxious and super unreliable or even impossible with some enemies. The random crits not only end up feeling more consistent, but provide an additional avenue for builds to play around or for giving strengths and weaknesses between weapon types. It's both quality of life and provides more variety, which is always good. And just to expand on that, overall the stats added for melee weapons in Wonderlands were just incredibly good, being crit damage, crit chance, and swing speed. Though I do think in Wonderlands they were a little bit underutilized. In theory though, what they allow for is better definition between these strengths and weaknesses between melee weapon subclasses, and to a almost more impactful degree than the stats on guns. These stats just allowed for better tuning, especially when compared to the current iteration of melee in bladed weapons. In most Borderlands games, the meta melee weapon is always just whatever has the highest melee damage bonus, because that's really the only stat we've had. In Wonderlands, while I think the balance of these stats is questionable, which we'll get into in a second here, all these other numbers allowed for some weapons that specialize in higher damage but lower swing speed, lower damage but more crits, faster swings, whatever. Depending on your build, one of these stats could be more important than another, and in turn creates a little thing called synergy and build variety. As always with Wonderlands though, it's not all perfect, far from it in fact. So what went wrong? Continuing on with these stats, as I was mentioning, these are not balanced very well. Often there were just a few outliers of melee weapons that were really good while others were just sort of meh. Most builds would just go for the highest damage and not really care about swing speed because it wasn't that big of a DPS difference between them. The only thing that really made things like the pincushion and snake stick viable was how strong their unique effects were for very specific builds. But on any more generic build, you would often just default to an Echo Banshee, which Echo brings up a whole other problem. The affixes were just incredibly unbalanced, though this was mostly due to the existence of Echo. For those unaware, each melee weapon could roll some affixed terms that would add additional effects on top of your melee swings. Usually this was maybe some lifesteal or extra cooldown rate, but Echo took it to the extreme by adding 10% of all non-melee damage dealt in the last 10 seconds as bonus damage. If you've played BL3, yeah, this is just a slightly toned down groundbreaker. And while toned down, it was still incredibly busted. Most of the other affixes were pretty tame, mostly just adding a little bonus, while Echo was literally game-changing. Someone at Gearbox just couldn't let go of Groundbreaker despite how disgustingly broken it proved to be. There's more problems with melee than words and stats though. The actual gameplay of melee in Wonderlands was also just incredibly weak. I don't mean weak as in not powerful, but instead weak as in completely shallow and unenjoyable. You really just hold your melee button and W towards enemies. There's not any sort of decision making or comboing to it, you just walk forward and swang your shit around. Which, while I do just so happen to be very good at, as my arrest records will show, this sort of brain-off gameplay can be fun, but honestly, I end up preferring the melee gameplay of previous games more so than I did Wonderlands. But there's even more that contributed to that lacking gameplay, being knockback and flying enemies. For being the first Borderlands game to have actual melee weapons, it's also the most punishing Borderlands game if you choose to actually run a melee build. So many of the common enemies and even a huge amount of bosses are entirely unhittable with actual melee swings. And of a lot of the enemies that you can hit with melee, many of them have some form of knockback to keep you off of them. So half the time you end up feeling either like a helpless calf, too short to suckle from your mother's teat, or the yo-yo of Shu Takeda. And my final point of bitching here, I don't like the melee slot. I think it creates a waste of space whether you're using a melee build or a gun build, and leads to a really weird state where some melee weapons exist purely to fill that space on a gun build, and some guns exist just to be held while using a melee build. If you want to play melee, then you really don't have a need for a gun, and it would be better to have those melee-focused legendary effects like on the live wire on a melee weapon itself, or tied to something other than a gun, like a relic, shield, whatever. On top of that, it seems like it could further push the problem of there usually only being a handful of melee weapons worth using, and usually only one per build. Obviously, this here is just speculation, as I don't know the thought process of the devs, but effort to balance more of Wonderland's melees against each other may have been lacking, because what's the point if melee builds only have one slot anyways? Every build is locked to using a single weapon, might as well just keep it more standardized. Gun builds get to use all 4 of their slots for weapons that they'll actually use, why not give the same option to melee? Especially with Wonderlands' addition of elemental damage on melee weapons, it seems counterproductive to only be able to have one equipped at a time. But with the good and the bad out of the way, let's get to fixing melee weapons. Starting with better definition between the strengths and weaknesses of manufacturers. The difference in stats between 2 weapons should be far greater. You should actually feel like you're losing out on something to take a lower speed, high damage weapon over a faster swinging weapon. We'll get more into this when I actually talk manufacturers, but each subclass should actually have a real strength and weakness in their stats and a real purpose to using one over the other. Hell, I'd also even be all for the idea of adding more stats to tune around. Amara had a melee range increase through Find Your Center, and that could feel absolutely game-changing. Having different melee weapons have varied ranges could be great, not only for balance between them, but also just to better fit thematics. A longsword should probably be able to hit a little further than a dead fish. Along with this, keep crit chance and damage as stats on melees. As I said earlier, I think the random crits were incredibly helpful to the gameplay of melee and also provided more stats to play around with, not only for balancing, but for build crafting. Overall, I like the idea of melee weapons having a stat spread of damage, swing speed, range, crit damage, and crit chance. Guns have damage, fire rate, accuracy, handling, reload speed, and mag size. I don't see why melee shouldn't have a similar amount of stats to them. Now coming to affixes, I think as an actual system they are okay. Having a standard pool that all weapons can roll from is good, they just need to not be overwhelmingly strong like Echo was. And I mean, most other affixes like Ancient or Rampage for example are actually still really solid, they're just totally outclassed by Echo in most cases, and this is just really a problem with the fact that Echo exists. Without Echo, I think the current state of them as a whole would be pretty good. Not stupidly strong, but still good enough to warrant looking for a specific one to synergize with. And as I mentioned, I really don't like the melee slot, just get rid of it. There's no real reason for it, and it really just nerfs melee builds. Especially with melee weapons having those elements on them, you should be able to freely swap between 4 if you so choose. Along with that, it'll mean that melee-focused effects stay on melee weapons rather than having guns that only exist for use on melee builds, which just ends up feeling bad for people that like melee builds and people that like gun builds. The game as a whole also shouldn't straight up punish you for playing melee. Flying enemies are okay, but they just need to not be the main enemy type that appears literally everywhere. Also, don't have a bunch of fucking knockback on 2/3 of enemies because that makes mobbing so fucking aneurysm-inducingly frustrating. But finally here, and to lead into the next section, melee gameplay needs more depth than just swinging and walking towards an enemy, and I think there's a pretty good solution here that still stays pretty simple. When you're holding a melee weapon, you have 3 types of attacks. Left click is the usual Wonderlands melee, a constant swinging in front of you. We'll call this the light attack. Right click is your heavy attack, being a slower attack than your light, but dealing more damage. And while holding a melee weapon, your quick melee is now also replaced with a special ability, being something far more flashy than the other 2 and having a cooldown. Both the special and the heavy attacks can be used while still holding light attack, allowing you to pull off some fluid comboing. The actual function of these heavy and special attacks will of course vary between manufacturers to help further carve out their niches, but also providing even more options for really making some cool stuff when it comes to legendaries. Now moving into those actual manufacturer concepts, I'd just like to remind you I am not a game dev and this probably isn't going to be balanced. Everything prior to this is serious suggestions, everything after this is just concepts I made up for fun. Along with that, as I go over these weapons, I'm not going to go over every single stat, I'll just be covering covering those that I think are more relevant to what I'm going for with the weapons niche. So starting out here with Jacobs, these are rapiers. They're always non-elemental. They have the highest range but mid to lower base damage. They also have a low crit chance but very high crit damage. What's unique with Jacobs is the left click is not full auto. Instead, it swings as fast as you can click. There's also no heavy attack. Instead, this is replaced by a passive effect where the longer you swing at the same speed, the higher damage you deal up to a cap. Keeping a tempo here is key, as you'll lose your combo damage if you change too drastically too quickly. The Jacobs special attack has a brief windup before lunging forward, dealing increased damage. This will not break your light attack combo and can actually be used to extend it. COV weapons have more variants in potential weapon heads than most, able to be scrappy battle axes, bats with nails in them, or buzz axes. Every COV melee weapon can roll as a dual wield, giving much higher swing speed but lower damage and range. Stats-wise, COV is generally an all-around middle ground with a higher crit chance. Heads will change these stats a bit more significantly, with bats being more so the true average, battle axes having slightly longer range, higher damage, lower speed, and buzz axes being the fastest with highest crit chance but the lowest base damage and range. COV has a generic heavy attack, but the special will throw you into a frenzy, gaining increased move speed, swing speed, and melee crit chance. When on cooldown, that cooldown will be reduced by dealing crit damage. Torg is just massive rocket-powered hammers, having longer range and swinging in an arc. They also explode on hit. The theme here, of course, being lots of AoE. They're very slow, have a very high base damage, low crit chance, and mid to low crit damage. Heavy attack is a big overhead rocket-boosted swing with far less AoE, but will ignite the enemy hit regardless of the weapon's element, with the special being a large 360-degree sweep that will hit everything in an area around you, knocking them back. Maliwan is always elemental futuristic katanas, able to come in 2 elements each, and of course able to swap with the usual mode switch. Overall, they're pretty middle of the road, only really having a higher crit damage than average. They have a generic heavy attack, but the special will teleport you behind the targeted enemy, with the next attack on them having a guaranteed crit chance. Nothing personal, kid. And finally here, Doll manufactures combat knives. These have a very short range, fast swing, but burst fire for lack of a better term. The light attack is a very quick set of 3 slashes before a brief lockout. The heavy is a slow but high damage stab which deals significantly increased damage from behind. And there is no active special, but instead passively allows you to be invisible while crouched. This would probably need to have a time limit to it, maybe only like 4 seconds or so, but would instantly drop aggro when used. After exiting, it would then have a cooldown before it could be used again. Either this cooldown would just be a set time that's somewhat shorter, or a longer cooldown that reduces on enemy kill. Yes, this is my favorite concept. Yes, it's probably incredibly hard to balance, and yes, I played a lot of Spy. While that is the final manufacturer out of the ones that I think would produce melee weapons, oh boy, we're not done here yet, because as always, you know your boy got carried away and came up with some uniques. Starting out with the comically large spoon. I don't know what manufacturer this would be, but it would have a high damage with a slow swing speed and heals on kill for 10% of the killing blow damage and will always jib targets. The Groundbreaker, which is a Torg hammer, incredibly low swing speed but high damage. When the Groundbreaker is held, slamming creates a large shockwave, knocking enemies into the air briefly. The Basilisk, which is a Doll knife, and this is a ballistic knife. The light and heavy attacks are normal, but the special is instead replaced with the ability to fire out the blade, another being digistructed in its place. This does completely replace the usual special effect of Doll knives. The Blitzkrieg is a super fast swinging buzz axe, and of course can roll as a dual wield. While in frenzy with the Blitzkrieg, attacks create an incendiary nova centered on yourself. The unfair advantage from Maliwan, which only has 1 element but can still use the element swap button to instead swap the weapon to fire bullets, in which case it will consume sniper ammo. And finally here is the Rhythm Blade from Jacobs. As long as you keep tempo, each attack will alternate between incendiary and shock damage. This also plays music with each attack. But that's about all I got for this one. Those were just my thoughts and suggestions on the matter though. If you've got your own, I'd love to hear them down in the comments below. If you're new here and you like these sorts of Borderlands discussion videos, then you're in luck because I've got a whole playlist of them. But if you're just looking forward to more, then definitely consider subscribing and maybe liking the video. That's not about do it for this one though. I hope you guys enjoyed. I will be live right after this video goes up, right here on YouTube and also over on Twitch, where there will be a link to down in the description below. And just under that is a link to my Discord server where you can come and join and hang out. But with that all being said, I hope to see you guys in the next one.